Tonight's talk is titled Housing, Social Mobility and What Needs to Change. And it's co-hosted, I'm proud to say, with the Gilded Acorn, conversation between Hashi Mohamed and Arthur Kay.
Huge thanks to Lucy, Grant and the Temple Bar Trust team for hosting us, and great to see you all as well. The most important thing about today is your questions as well. We have the honour of having Hashi here with us and his two amazing books. But please, this is not just me asking questions, it's going to be coming to you guys first, and you need to ask the clever questions because I'm just going to tee Hashi up for the big ones. I'm going to start with a pub quiz question, so fingers on buzzers. Okay, hands up when you realise what this list is calling out. Young, Curry, Jones, Armstrong, Rainsford, Faulkner.
Planning ministers.
Yes, very good. Housing ministers since 28 since 1993.
Easy.
So yeah, very, very good indeed. So we're going to start with a not so subtle lead in there in terms of the kind of how this is all connected with the politics from the very, very top. We're going to also go back and I'm going to ask you about Mahatma Gandhi House next. But if we start at the top in terms of that, 2018 since you moved to this country in 1993. And in that period of time, you've had 28 housing ministers. How do you kind of see that in terms of setting the wider scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for having me. Thank you, Lucy, for inviting me here. Thank you all for making the time to be here on a Monday evening. But I think when I think about that list, to be fair to the context of those numbers, there's a massive bulge towards the end of it as opposed to kind of other bits. So that kind of reflection of that latter half is a good context. I mean, also remember we had like 5 or 6 prime ministers in a period of 5 years. So it's not exactly the most stable period for anything. But I want to go back to the sort of post-war period when we were coming out of this period of war and not much was being built, much was destroyed, and there was this question of Britain kind of rebuilding again. And it's interesting when you look back in that sort of post-1945 period, housing was actually in the public health department because housing was seen as a public health issue as opposed to sort of a bricks and mortar, this is where we will find growth, this is where, it wasn't seen as such. And when the new thing that was going to be called the National Health Service was going to be founded, there's this fantastic foreword written by Beveridge talking about the promise of the NHS not going to live up to its expectations if we don't get a hold of the issue of housing. Because his analysis was that if you end up building all of these homes and people go back to these places that they are going to live, what will then happen is they will all end up incubating a lot of communicable diseases. They will then come to the schools to share those diseases, and before we know it, this new National Health Service thing that's free is going to be completely and utterly overwhelmed. But if we grapple with the issue of living conditions, homes, sanitation, and the basics, then this National Health Service might actually have a chance. And so when you think about the way we were thinking about this issue in 1945 onwards, and you think about the public health direction, the holistic policy making that thinks about public health, housing, and actually sees this picture in a holistic image, we don't have that kind of world today. And so to go back to your question about the housing minister, frankly, most people see that ministerial job as a stepping stone to something else, right? Nobody ever sits there and thinks housing is probably one of the most important things that you could deal with as a minister, frankly. No. They're thinking of a bigger ministerial red box, a bigger car, a bigger post, Secretary of State, and so on. But to end on a positive note, I am incredibly optimistic about our current housing minister, Matthew Pennycook. This is somebody who is very much plugged into the industry. He is very much plugged into the planning world. he's got a lot more than planning on his desk. He's got to deal with cladding and Grenfell and fire safety and building regulations and leasehold reform. So he's got a lot more than housing on his plate. But I genuinely have been so enthused and genuinely impressed by how much he's been doing. Question is, how long can we hold on to him for? And that's the million-dollar question.
And you see kind of working closely with the Deputy Prime Minister in terms that the MPPF is going to have material change then I know we've got a room full of, I mean, how many have we got in terms of professionals in the built environment? Are most of you working in this space? By show of hands, I'm getting a lot of nods of heads, lots. Any specific planners? Any planners want to own up? Mainly architects and
I'll go to transport planning.
Transport planning, great stuff. So yeah, with the NPPF specifically, these are people who will be working as architects and
for those of you who might not be familiar with it, this is the National Planning Policy Framework that for the last 3 years seems to have been reformed every Christmas, which is just a bit weird. But this last Christmas was probably one of the most transformative, and I would honestly say that the changes that we've seen in the last NPPF is probably once in a generation type of reform. Particularly around how we view and have a relationship with the green belt, how we view the ways in which we're going to try and allow for communities to grow in a sustainable way. I'm incredibly optimistic about that, and so I'll start with a few optimistic things and then temper it with a few other things that we need to think about. In the book, I talk about the green belt being the most successful planning policy ever. It has successfully stopped everything from happening. So it has stopped development from taking place, ostensibly for a good reason, to stop urban sprawl, to stop settlements merging into one another, and so on. But actually, it stopped everything else. And in many ways, it has been a block on progress and has been treated by policymakers, decision takers, and others as the holy grail. And I argue in the book how much the green belt is associated with, in our consciousness, the green and pleasant land. When you think about the green belt, you think about the sort of lovely undulating hills that you go by on a train and look out of the window and think about Christopher Wren or Shakespeare or whoever it might be. When actually so much of the green belt, particularly around London and elsewhere, is not that pleasant and certainly not green. And how do you have that conversation? There's a lovely statistic that I love sharing with people, but the green belt just around London is the size of Trinidad and Tobago. Get that in your boots. And it's just sort of, what does that conversation look like? And I think the conversation that's moved on to do with grey belt and how we can make sure that in sustainable locations we release enough housing is honestly, as I said, a game changer. But it's an important but. It's very hard for you to introduce all of these transformative things and expect them to work within a parliament when the problems we face have been a generational problem, right? This is a problem that we've got to this point for about 25 years. It took us to get to this point. I would genuinely pick that sort of 79 Margaret Thatcher period onwards, a series of changes, nothing political about this, but it could be everything from right to buy to the liberalisation of our economy to not building enough housing, selling off the housing stock that we had, and so on and so forth. But now you've introduced this, you're dealing with local authorities that have dissipated their resources and you still need them to make decisions locally, just don't have the finances, the resources to be able to do that. You've then introduced them, probably one of the biggest reorganisation of local government and local decision making also in a generation. You're expecting planning inspectors to make decisions about major developments. You're recovering many of the appeals and therefore potentially taking away local decision making and local accountability, ostensibly to send a message, but you could come unstuck. And planning is politics, right? Politics is planning. Whether we like it or not, nowhere else that I can think of anywhere else in the world is planning and politics so closely aligned and so used in a local context than in Britain. And so I'm incredibly optimistic about the reforms when you look at them in the round. I am slightly unsure about how it will play out in terms of the practicalities. But the one thing I do know, which is very sad, but also I'm grateful for, is whatever happens, they need barristers, it turns out. So I will be busy. For that, I'm grateful.
I'm looking forward to some view. I've got my own views on the grey belt and the green belt, but I'm looking forward to hearing some from the urban design professionals in the room shortly. One of the things that we've jumped straight into a relatively kind of technical discussion about this kind of stuff, but one of the things in both your books is a very, very personal story as well. So I wonder if you could kind of talk about this, the link that I think a lot of people know intuitively, but you draw pretty explicitly between social mobility and housing.
Yeah.
And again, if we use a jumping off spot, why Mahatma Gandhi House was the most important building in the world for you for a time.
Definitely. I mean, I think many of you here may or may not have followed my work, but the first book was all about social mobility, and it was connected to my own personal story of coming here as a young refugee and growing up in northwest London, and how I then went from there to being state educated, etc., and then went on to becoming a barrister that I am now. And what did I learn along that trajectory? What were the do's and don'ts? What was it that elevated my opportunities in a way that finds me in one of the most elite professions in the country, in the best barristers' chambers for what I do? And all of that is what I try and talk about in great detail in the first book. And then I realized that here I was, as somebody who has been growing up in housing precariousness for a period of a decade, how I find myself now working in planning, and particularly in housing, at a time when this has never been more important than ever before. But also half the time you're sitting there and you're arguing about policies that talk about, you know, how high you can build and what are the impacts on various things, what's the impact on St. Paul cathedrals, you know, viewpoints and so on, when you don't realize actually this is about human beings, about people, about hope, about ambition, about social mobility. So in the second book, A Home of One's Own, which you'll see, hopefully many of you will notice, well, that's me as a 7-year-old boy, and hopefully you'll see the key in the middle of, which is, you know, the idea being that, you know, a home of one's own, giving you that opportunity, that access to a different future. And Mahatma Gandhi House was a building that used to be the place where Brent Council used to have all of their housing officers, basically, and you would turn up every day hoping to be removed from the squalor council accommodation that had all this mold that was killing you. And I grew up with a very severe asthma based on that, and so much of that experience and what it meant and what it felt like was a huge part of what I was trying to get across in the book, but also tying together social mobility, housing, opportunity, a framework for success, that early years for a child, what that stability looks like, how much potential you will lose when so many of your countrymen and women are unable to secure a roof over their heads. It's a massive waste of opportunity and potential, and that's part of what I was trying to put across in the second book.
And that kind of link between, is it as simple as saying if you have decent housing that you have a good foundation from which to build other things, or is it kind of deeper and more important than that?
There is no doubt in my mind, and all the research shows this when I looked at this book, the first book on social mobility, and I was looking at the second book on housing, there is no doubt in my mind that there is a direct correlation, a very clear correlation between the first 4 years of a child's life being stable, secure, safe, and well structured, those first 4 years, and their likelihood to not necessarily become a barrister and do all these things, but actually their ability to not develop health issues, mental health issues, ability to start focusing on education, not turn up to school hungry and unable to concentrate, fulfill their potential, and so much more. So if we accept that the analysis of most of the child psychologists will tell you about that first 4 years. Incidentally, when the new Labour government came in '97, one of the big things they put into a huge amount of work was Sure Start. Many of you guys will remember the Sure Start program, which was scrapped, and how much of a difference that made. Those first 4 years are critical. So if you accept that analysis, where else is a child going to be safe for the first 4 years of their lives? They're not going to be safe moving around from one squad, accommodation to the next. They're not going to be secure in an environment where that part of their lives is unstable. And so for me, I will beat the drum of this as much as I possibly can, But if we live in a society that cannot genuinely secure the first crucial years of any child, we're in trouble.
So I'm a signatory to something called the Healthy Homes Pledge. Have any of you heard of this before? Which is kind of part of the eventually failed Healthy Homes Act, which was brought forward by someone called Lord Nigel Crisp, who was the former CEO of the NHS, which was brought to Parliament last November and failed. What's the kind of, I'm still kind of unclear in terms of the kind of very simplistic narrative I have is this kind of like the baddie Tories are kind of sitting there being very tight with cash and not building the amount of social housing that's needed. But I feel it's more kind of complex than that in terms of, is it just councils need to build more stock, or what are some of the other things that you see kind of stopping things like the Healthy Homes Act coming through? Because it's relatively simple stuff. They're suggesting more natural light, ventilation, the things that kind of we know make a home a healthy place to live, or a non-squalid place to live as the very minimum, let's say.
It's worth just reflecting on how we've got to this point from a few different perspectives. So, for example, if you think about a time like 1979, before the first Thatcher government came into power, close to almost half of Britain's population lived in some form of government or council housing, right? 1979, close to half. By the time I was writing this book, it was something like less than 4%. And the reason why that's important is because we went from a transition of an ambition to build places like new towns to councils being the custodians of a local asset that was there for the common good. Query whether they were able to keep up with the various works they needed to do. If you watch Cathy Come Home by Ken Loach, you can see in the 1960s how poor the upkeep of many of the council houses. We had proper slums here in Britain. You know, in the 1960s, you had actual slums in the United Kingdom. So it's not all utopia in that sense pre-1979 either. But you have this mind shift, and it's a very simple mind shift, where your home is the bricks and mortar that is your safety and security, a place that you relax and call home, that you one day might pass on to your children, but it's a place where you saw it as your safety and security. To a shift where your home became a commodity, right? An asset class that you were threatened by, even though your house was built on this field. If somebody dared to build something close to you on the next field, it was outrageous. Because you felt this was all that you had, you poured your emotional, personal, financial, everything into it. And that was what your legacy was going to be and your inheritance. And that shift has also caused so much for local authorities who've ended up having to sell off many of their properties, partly because they can't afford to keep them, but partly because of the discounts that were introduced with the right to buy opportunity. By the way, right to buy was actually originally a Labour idea. If you look to the research, it was actually a Labour idea, and when the Tories came into power, Maggie Thatcher thought, that's a great one, I'll have that. And even though people always associate it with the Maggie Thatcher government, if you look at the research, I did a podcast with a couple of the old guard of the Labour Party, and they were so proud about the fact that it was originally a Labour idea, but it was taken over by the Tories. But one of the fundamental impacts that the right to buy system had, which is absolutely insane when you think about it today, is the idea was to give people ownership over their homes and give them that opportunity and their chance of taking ownership and responsibility, right? And the way that the Tories saw it was property owning democracy. If they own their own homes, they dip their fingers in the blood of the market and the mortgage system. They will have a more vested interest in keeping the status quo working. They will want to conserve the status quo. They will become conservatives. And that was the theory. And that's how it's always been seen. But then when you're selling off so many houses and you're not replacing them in the same amount that you're replacing them, something has got to give at some point. But then the worst part of it was you go down Lambeth, Brixton, all around the major cities that you see where massive amounts of housing was already owned. You sold them off, and then you then ended up renting them back to house people on temporary accommodation. So imagine, these were homes that you once owned, that you sold off at a discount, and now you're using some of those houses to rehouse your homeless at a market rate. You couldn't design a more insane system. And that's the rot that we're now trying to unstick. And it's not going to be unstuck in 5 minutes or in 5 years, but likely more 10 years. And then the final thing I'll say also, there's also a practical problem, right? Councils don't build houses anymore. Councils don't borrow money anymore. One of the other things that Margaret Thatcher did was the councils were allowed to sell houses, but they weren't allowed to keep the proceeds. It had to come back to the Treasury. So they then weren't able to actually rejuvenate, partly because she thought that the Labour-held councils in Merseyside, for example, were putting more money in their pockets than they were into the system, which was always a way of disparaging parts of the country that weren't getting their votes. So there are practicalities about borrowing money, kind of institutional knowledge that's died or moved on, bricks and literally like materials. Since leaving the European Union, we've lost a huge amount of workforce. So there's many practical issues that also come with these reforms and the way that we're looking at this.
Yeah. And maybe in the Q&A we'll get more into this kind of specifics in terms of how local authorities, as developers, or certainly as planning authorities, and maybe as developers and their kind of recent forays into that have gone to. But to push back slightly on the commodification or the kind of turning of housing into an asset class, this has been a kind of global movement generally, from Toronto to Shenzhen or wherever. This has happened over the 80s, 90s and noughties. And so can you really blame, I know you're not blaming Margaret Thatcher, but is this part of a piece in that Britain has been one economy amongst many that has gone through that financialisation of housing more broadly? I guess just to comment on that.
Very easy.
And is that a fair thing to kind of beat this up with if we do exist in a...
It's a very easy question to answer, because the very simple point about this way of thinking in terms of the market, you're absolutely right. If you go, there is a correlation between where young people are excited to be and wanting to work and want to find opportunity, love and life and so on, and prices for housing, right? If you look at all of the places that have seen this massive skyrocketing in Vancouver, Toronto, New York, London, Paris, wherever it is, there is a correlation between where young people want to go and live and work and start their lives and this crazy numbers game. Where I come off in terms of understanding this is pretty straightforward. Housing and the market was never going to work. Housing and the market was never going to work. The idea that such an important asset or such an important aspect of our community lives the idea that we could have left it to the market to regulate itself.
But
that's as a global, not necessarily just Britain itself. But the idea that you could just leave it, and I'll give you one simple example. If you're a Londoner growing up in London and you're getting paid salaries in this place, how can it make sense that you, born and bred in London, are competing to buy a house with somebody who's got global capital? It just doesn't make any sense. If you're working and living here and wanting to actually build your life here, you're competing with people who want to park their cash here. How is that possible? How does that work? And that's the fundamental misapprehension, is if you were a Londoner and you were getting paid £200,000 to compete with somebody, fair enough. But you're not. You're getting paid £35,000 and you're competing with a guy who's buying a house for his son, who's just been born, for when he comes to university. It's bonkers. So for me, leaving housing to the market was never going to work. It was always doomed. And that's why I argue this idea of saying to a developer, build housing and then maybe 50% affordable, that's for the birds. Let the market do what the market does and let local government do what it's supposed to do. You don't go to Sainsbury's and say, hey, can you show me your aisles that is 50% off? You don't do that because it's a different market where what you earn has some sort of a relationship with what you can afford to eat, right? That's not the housing market. So that's where the way I understand this issue and the way I see it is the idea of the market functioning in a way that would ensure our homes are for the people who want to live and work here was never ever going to work, and it still doesn't work. Happy to be pushed back on this, but that's the reality of what we face.
Well, we can come back to this discussion around kind of Section 106s and civil.
Yeah.
Stuff
Or Section 52. Who remembers
in
the Section 52 back in the day? The precursor to Section 52.
Oh, really? Good stuff. Well, yeah.
I wasn't even born, so don't worry.
But on this question of kind of the global city, which it does really come down to, because why the housing crisis matters, the housing crisis exists, as you say, in relatively small parts of a relatively small number of cities around the world. You don't have a housing crisis in rural Wales or rural Ontario or where it happens to be. You have housing crisis in quite specific parts, which is a kind of
which is where people are being pushed and people coming to and having that opportunity. You're right.
So is it fair to even call it a housing crisis? I mean, the way I've framed it in the past has been like it's less snappy for a headline, but cost of suitable urban building land, which is
another way.
That's
there's
a reason why he's written the book and I'm not asking questions. But
affordability crisis. It's an affordability crisis.
But it's so specific that when we do come up with these kind of grand theories around how it all ties together, it is quite myopic. It kind of is, let's say, 30 cities around the world and 100 neighbourhoods or 1,000 neighbourhoods.
It's an affordability crisis as much as a point that you're making there. But I completely agree with you. Just calling it a housing crisis is just ridiculous. Because if you're earning the kind of money you're earning in London, you could go to Blackpool and get a 4-bed house for like 90 grand. But you're not going to find the jobs or the opportunities that you need. So actually, maybe a completely different market would ensure that you would have the kind of jobs that would allow you to have a good quality of life and not come to London or the big cities and so on and so forth. So it's the market. It's the way that the market has been shifted and put together is it simply has concentrated opportunity and life chances in very specific places. And that's what then sucks everything down to the southeast and the home counties like a vortex, frankly.
And it's one of the great ironies of things like globalization and various internet technologies and even remote work that it should mean that we're increasingly spread out, and that's less the case. But one of the kind of bizarre things about urban economics is that it still does suck it in. And you mentioned kind of like dating opportunities earlier. Like a big reason that young people come to cities is to meet people, meet friends, meet potential romantic partners, meet economic opportunities.
Definitely. And I mean, I'm doing a case right now in Salisbury for the local authority, and it's fascinating because you get in a taxi and you talk to the guy and he's like, oh yeah, I've lived here for 40 years. And he said, oh, it's great for when you're young up to about 15. terrible when you're between 15 and 25 or 30, perfect for when you're post 40, you know. And it's like that kind of understanding of how, and then I said, but what does that do to the housing market? We said the housing market is like non-existent, because if you're in that bracket where you desperately need the houses, you're not going to be able to afford it because you're either living at home, or when you're too old, you're probably not going to want, you know. So it's that kind of mismatch of the market that this is fundamentally the essence of what I'm saying. It's that mismatch between the market that we're asking people to function in and the kind of life that people want to lead. That's fundamentally what it comes down to, you know. And unless you're earning crazy amounts of money, this is beyond your reach. Or you're going to be working all your life to get something that is untenable. That's really how I characterize it in the book.
And in the book, you don't necessarily say that getting on the housing ladder or owning a home is the be-all and end-all. So you're not framing it as that, but there is this kind of, I guess, the broader narrative because of the mindset of, in the UK specifically, home ownership.
Yeah, but I'm very careful about that, because I agree with, I do say that it's not always the end-all and be-all, but at the same time, it's quite rich from somebody who's a homeowner to say to somebody who might not be a homeowner, hey, don't worry about it, it's all overrated anyway. Yeah. Especially when you're living in crap squalor accommodation, you can't get hold of your landlord because, you know, he's a slum landlord or whatever. So for me, I always say that argument of saying to someone, don't worry about it, it's not all that's cracked up to be, can only have real force behind it if there's a genuine choice. If there is a genuine choice where you could rent and live a good quality of life and not be tied down, or buy and be tied down, then it's a genuine choice. But if at the moment it's like really crap housing from a slum landlord, or really expensive rental accommodations of these built-to-rent sectors, or to buy, that's not really a fair choice. Built-to-rent, I describe as the solution to a problem we shouldn't have, you know.
And I can't find it right now, but there's a section where you talk about, I think it's like 73% of young people want to own their own home, but then also you got to say that if you've got £1,000 in your pocket, then affordable. If your home is 200 grand, 500 grand, £1 million, whatever it is, it's still unaffordable in that thing. So
yeah, that's a very interesting point, because most people, you know, whenever you read about young people, they always talk about how they're spaffing up all their money on Netflix and avocados, and they're not interested in buying houses. It's just like the complete and utter mischaracterization of what young. The truth is, actually, the vast majority of young people would like the opportunity. Doesn't necessarily mean they will all take it, but they would love the opportunity to be able to own their own home. Yeah. And we're not giving them that opportunity. Instead, we're like telling them it's overrated. Don't worry about it. It's not that all that's cracked up to be. And now, there's also, going back to the social mobility point, I think in the next 10 years, we're going to start seeing, next 5 years, we're going to see that whole boomer generation pass down a great deal of wealth to the next generation. We're about to see the largest transfer of wealth through the generations in the next 5 to 10 years. And what's really interesting about that is, in social mobility terms, who inherits that stuff is so arbitrary, right? Because by sheer accident of birth, you will be able to move on and secure your life's futures, as opposed to somebody else who's trying to catch up. And that will be, again, another way of understanding that question of what it means to have that life chances.
And further compounding all of those social issues we're already having.
Absolutely.
So I've got a friend who's a slightly dodgy personal finance guru, and he talks about this concept. I mean, he says it in much more flowery language than you do, but he talks about the concept, he calls it the drawbridge, of saying that on one side you have asset class owners, including home ownership, on the other side you've got people who aren't asset class owners, including renters and others, and that if you're on, as this multi-trillion-dollar pound transfer of wealth happens over the next 5, 10, 15 years, if you're on the one side, it's going to get increasingly good, and on the other side, it's going to get increasingly bad. So I think you put it in a much more kind of
absolutely
grounded
right.
and
that's absolutely right. It's going to be transformative in a way that and this is the fundamental conclusion of that. The gap between the rich and the poor is just we're going to start seeing that in a way that we've never seen before after this.
And would, to kind of keep down this kind of like financialisation route, is it asset owning more generally, or is it specifically housing? So as in, if you look at, let's say, housing in London has, since I was born, like house prices in London have gone up. I mean, I think the average house price when I was born was £79,000. It's now £480,000 over 34 years or whatever it is. If you were to do a similar thing and just owning an asset, a stock, a share, a bond, or whatever it happens to be, you would probably not be miles off in terms of that growth. And so there is an argument about saying, if we look, there's obviously literally just the living in rented accommodation, as long as that home is decent and you have the economic means to do so, versus where is it actually best to put an amount of capital.
But the difference between an asset class that's based on markets and bonds and sort of whatever you've decided to invest in, Tesla or whatever, and housing, the difference between those two, for me, is very simple. This particular asset class of housing is only worth this because of deliberate, successive governments effectively failing to do what they're supposed to do for a generation that just drives up this thing that everyone wants a piece of, right? So if you think about it from selling council houses, not building enough housing, giving what I call the crack cocaine of that to the house builders of the Help to Buy, subsidizing this ridiculous housing structure, quantitative easing when we crashed, and so on and so forth. This asset class is a completely and utterly contrived Ponzi scheme. I mean, let's be frank about that. And I call it a Ponzi scheme in the book. It's a completely contrived, made up Ponzi scheme that is only worth what it's worth based on this mad trajectory that we've seen. On the other side, the flip side, if you bought shares in Facebook, if you bought shares in Tesla, if you bought shares in Amazon, that's a genuine market that's come out of the ground, and whether you like it or not, by hook or by crook, has got up to that point and is doing what it's doing really, really well. And that's where I struggle with that kind of analogy,
We're going to come back to this specific point, but I'm going to push back on you slightly there. So, I mean, Richard Florida is a kind of an urban geographer type, and he's written a book called New Urban Crisis, amongst others. And he basically compares rents in very successful cities, again, rents and sale prices in very successful cities, and they do all follow basically the same thing, that if you're a successful city, obviously I'm talking economically successful, you're doing other things terribly, including housing, but if you're a successful city, you will end up in this bubble. And so you end up with New York, Toronto, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Paris. With these same bubbles. So are they all making the same? I'm being provocative potentially, but are they all is it not the curse of success that you become a desirable place which has a thriving film industry? Everyone wants to move there. You end up with more people moving there. You end up with a whole bunch of opportunities that come from that, and that results in a finite number of bedrooms with people wanting to.
There is definitely something to be said for immigration and drawing success and people coming to these particular places. But that is not necessarily inconsistent with the consistent failure of governments to respond to the needs of your population based on what you're creating. So in other words, if I'm sitting in Downing Street and I'm thinking to myself, I've got all these fiscal policies that will bring French bankers to me, Polish builders to me, and I've created an environment where you want to come and invest here, you want to work here, you want to study here, etc. How the hell do you not sit there and think, where are these people going to live? Where are they going to catch a train and a bus? I mean, how does that not occur to you? You're thinking, they're going to come here with all their wealth, but you don't necessarily, and then you think, they're going to come here with all their wealth. I've created the environment for them to be able to do that. But have I prepared my own citizens to be able to do the same elsewhere? Have I prepared my own citizens to be able to compete in this market? I just don't understand how that doesn't occur to a policymaker.
Yeah. I completely agree. It's deeply depressing. But you'll be housing minister soon.
I don't know. They will never pay me enough.
Okay, so you're housing minister. By
Matthew
my
Pennycook is doing
by
a
my
good
blessing
job.
this out, by tomorrow morning, and you're going to work with Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer and others. You're going to scrap Section 106.
Yeah.
What are we going to do? What are the few things that you do if let's say give you 5 years, a nice chunky budget,
Yeah, I mean, I
What kind of
think
things are we doing?
if you want a specific answer on Section 106 agreements, which is basically a way of subsidising developments to ensure, there is a growing argument actually. There's people like, there's quite a few people writing about getting rid of agreements that get developers to subsidise stuff and instead just whack them with a tax and let them do whatever they want to do and let us crack on, but take that wealth. Because Rowan Moore is very good on this. If you get planning permission on your land to be able to do what you're going to do, particularly in a very lucrative location, that planning permission isn't something that you have just won on the basis of you coming here to build something. That planning permission comes with a premium that should be recouped for the public good. Rowan Moore writes about this quite well. And I believe in that, because if you're allowed the Qataris to build the Shard in one of the most popular, extraordinary places in the world, then why shouldn't we recoup a premium for the common good that helps us help our own citizens and make it better? I always say to myself, you know, you're walking down the street and you're not getting bombed from the air, or you're not, you know, something awful isn't happening. That's not free. That costs money, you know. That there's a reason why you can enjoy that life. You know, maybe your phone might get snatched, but you know, but you get what I'm saying. And so I don't know whether the mechanics of that taxation and how it will work and how it will be realized is effective and efficient. But I have one big criticism about it, which is why I would struggle wanting it to happen. And it's this. At the moment, if you're building 300-400 houses, you are compelled to ensure that 40 to 50% is affordable. By the way, affordable doesn't actually mean social housing. It usually means 70-80% of the market. But it compels you to create what we often refer to as a mixed and balanced community, where you're not just allowing the rich to have their poor door and rich door and keep people away from each other. And I fear if you get rid of the Section 106 agreements that tie the developers into ensuring that you realize a mixed and balanced community, what we're going to have is a situation where they'll say, give me my planning permission, here's a check, now fuck off.
Yeah, and they still often do that.
And sometimes they do that, but many times they don't get away with it. And that's where I struggle with this new sort of idea that let's let them do their thing and we'll do our thing as a public good. I don't think that we've got to a point where the system is so depleted and anemic and dysfunctional. And for them to then now say, give us our permission, here's a check, see you later, would stick in the throat for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it would make development easier from a developer perspective as well, because you can at least then forecast your plan. One of the big challenges, again, for those who are involved, is that Section 106 is typically a quite detailed negotiation that can take a very long time, and I imagine you negotiate yourself or are involved in those.
But they shouldn't take so much. They shouldn't take so long if you haven't done your proper due diligence early on, frankly. And I find that a lot of developers will struggle to agree these Section 106 agreements simply because they've just been so poor at doing their due diligence.
Yeah.
Interestingly, there's a new change in this government where they're compelling developers to actually agree and sometimes even sign the Section 106 agreement before the application goes in, because you should have done your homework to know what the issues are. And actually that is causing a lot of problems.
I can imagine.
It's causing a lot of problems for developers.
Isn't that just like a blank check because they don't know what it'll be at the end?
Well, they should have had a pre-application with the council to be able to know what the issues fundamentally are. And then if they don't have a Section 106 agreement that's more or less ready for engrossment, then something's gone wrong. That's the government's idea. In practical terms, you're right. It ends up being unilateral undertakings, but
I think didn't Gove have an idea to try and get rid of maybe one of his few to do a similar thing to kind of get rid of it and simplify the SIL and Section 106 process?
Yeah, and there are honestly very good reasons for simplifying the system. There are very good reasons for why things take long. But fundamentally, at the heart of all of this is developers saying, we're happy to pay our dues, but we don't feel like we have an obligation to society. And that doesn't sit well with me.
Do you think they are saying that?
I think so. And I work for many of them, trust me.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily going to say it outright to you, I don't have an obligation for society. But why else would you turn up and say, I want to build 300 houses there. I don't want to have any affordable housing on it. Or if I have to, I will do it. But I'd rather pay you this check and go off on my merry way.
Yeah.
Why else would you say that?
Yeah.
If you didn't feel, you may not verbalize it, but why else would you say that if you didn't feel like you had a duty to society?
Yeah.
That I'm telling you, that's the attitude for many. I can tell you some of the big house builders absolutely thrive in wanting to build mixed and balanced communities. Many of them will meet the affordable housing and more because they don't feel like that's the right, that they feel that that's the right thing to do. But I did an appeal for Westminster Council in Belgravia, the socialist bastion that is Belgravia. And they were building like 20 flats or something. And the council was insisting that they should have about, of those 20, like 5 of them should be affordable. They literally did not want to pay a penny of affordable housing. So instead they were keen to write the council a check for about 6 million. £6 million. They were willing to negotiate up to £10 million just so that they could get out of paying for this. And it was so hilarious because the inspector who was hearing this was like, I don't understand this. Like, why are you offering this amount of viability? Okay, fine. But if the viability is so bad, why? Because what they did was they said, viability, we can't afford any of it. But out of the goodness of our hearts, we'll give you about 5 units. You know, and you just sat there and you're just like, come on. Come off it.
Yeah.
And so then when you're sitting there, you realise they don't want to look bad. But why the hell would they want to build a single affordable unit in Belgravia? They're better off getting those flats. The penthouse suites one of the penthouse suites alone would come up to like £15 million each that they were going to build. Each 15 million. Why would you want a pauper bump into them in the corridor? Outrageous. So what I'm saying to you is that's a caricature of one example I can call on. But what I'm saying is if we go down the route of unshackling the developers from these public obligations, I fear that gulf will just get too great.
Yeah. And so we wouldn't do that. So this is day 2. You know?
I'm hoping to be persuaded.
So we're
I'm
trying
an
to
open-minded minister.
So we want to simplify it, but we're not. But we're going to keep this kind of relatively combative Section 106-esque process.
Yeah, I think so. For now,
we like the grey belt. We're going to open up some more building sites.
Build on. Listen, if you're near a train station and you're bound on at least 2 sides by the settlement boundary, build is my view.
Yeah.
And if as long as you can get to a decent school or a primary school or listen, there is so much of the green belt we could develop. So much. Sustainability is the main thing for me. Are you near a train station, near good bus stops, near the transport expert will tell you. For me, as long as the sustainability is there, everything else can be worked out. Landscape harms and heritage harms, all of that stuff is like, wishy-washy, whatever.
Yeah.
I get paid to argue about it. But for me, if you can walk, cycle, and run and avoid using a car as much as possible, bloody build.
All right. So day 3 in your ministerial career, you're given a large travel budget with your special advisor, who you've appointed me as your spouse.
Mr. K.
And we're going to go and see anywhere in the world where they're doing housing right.
First, I need to go see your tailor, but then after that, I'll.
So we're getting on a train somewhere.
Yes.
Where are we off to?
We're off to Denmark and Sweden and those kind of places, and possibly Norway, where it's bloody expensive, but if you work in the city, you can afford to live in the city. And that they must be doing right.
Yeah.
That's where I'd say. It's not perfect. I've been to Sweden many times. My wife is Swedish. I've been to Sweden many, many times. It's not perfect, but the way they see a home is fundamentally different to the way we see it.
And in your view, is that tied to a broader, I mean, those countries I would caricature as being, pretty progressive more broadly and having a,
Yes.
having a more,
Yes,
kind of...
but Switzerland, you wouldn't necessarily put in that category. But Switzerland is an example of a place where you could rent for 30 years and be pretty secure.
Yeah.
I mean, just the security of tenure that comes with renting for 30 years. I remember one of my friends who was living in Switzerland was saying he lives in a block of flat, and the owners may never meet their tenants for about 20 years. Maybe they might meet them once. But that building is well looked after, well engineered, and those people never fail to pay their rent. And that is an example of what's possible. It's an example of what's possible, The built-to-rent sector is an example of what's possible. It's bloody expensive, but you could get yourself a really nice furnished apartment, and great services and so on. So, yeah.
And before I open it up to questions which you've been diligently thinking of and writing down, what if there was someone in, I don't know, Sydney or Manila or Sao Paulo who's coming to the UK for a visit, and you're the housing minister on day 4, and you're showing them around the things you're really proud of that are currently working well? Are there any things or places?
Coin Street.
Coin Street. You're biased. You're
I'm
chair.
biased against it. Also not a perfect location, but that's an example of private wealth subsidising common good. It's not perfect by any means, but that whole land around that real estate was bought for £1. Camille will tell you all about it. And so that for me is a big part of what's possible. And the cooperative movement has demonstrated a real passion. It's not, again, always perfect. It requires people to cooperate. It requires people to get involved. It requires people to actually do something, but it's definitely possible. The Oxo Tower, where you might go up to Harvey Nichols, you wouldn't know, but there are 78 social housing flats between the ground on the South Bank River to the actual tower. 78 social housing. They're paying about £150 to £200 a week. They get a view of the River Thames. Wow. That's what's possible.
Ian Cooper from David Cooper and Co. I like your top, first of all, actually, I have to say.
Thank you very much.
That looks like an M&S special. I'm going to get
No,
one.
it is actually from a very cool shop in Edinburgh. I'll send you the
Very cool.
details. It's proper, Scottish product.
I'm afraid I'm less confident than you are. I'm confident that lots of data centres will get built. I'm confident they'll turn back the Conservatives, turn off the tap post-Chesham by-election. And I'm confident they will build more grey belt, which is clearly a good idea. But I think we are in for the nastiest, most contentious, most litigious planning parliament that any of us has ever seen.
Which is
good for business, but
there's a chap behind you.
Sorry.
excellent.
Very, very good points. Thank you very much. Do you want to respond to
No,
those,
just on the
only
only thing I would say something on is that the education point, I think, is a very, very good point. And I think that if we are going to grapple with social mobility, education is a big part of it. There is no question about that. And housing is also important for all the reasons we've been discussing, but education has got to be central, because that's the tools that you need to give people to be able to get out of their circumstances. Less common ground on the role of grammar schools. There's a whole bit in the book about that, because I think grammar schools are great, don't get me wrong. They do fantastic, but they cherry pick.
Well, any academy.
Any selective school is like that, So that's the only thing I would say.
Hi there, thank you, fascinating. I'm going to have a crack at a question, a short one. So I'm looking at that really delightful picture of that 7-year-old boy.
By the way, what you don't see in this picture is the jacket and the trousers don't match.
So
Well, the first point was, I think you already had a good tailor at the age of 7.
I know, but look this good. I'm learning now. Look at me.
So my question is, what sources of hope did that 7-year-old see as he came here and began his early life?
Well, that 7-year-old, to bring down the mood a little bit, would end up burying his dad at 9, and so it wasn't definitely that smile was not going to be sustained. And when I came here as a 9-year-old, I came having literally buried my father in April, and I was here in June, without my mum, without any of my siblings. There's 3 of us, and many of my other siblings ended up in America and Canada, and so on. And as I say in the first book, I genuinely could never, ever have imagined myself where I am today. There is, at the age of 18, I didn't know what a barrister did, let alone how to be one. And it's very hard to explain this to people because they will see me doing what I'm doing, working the way that I work, doing the kind of things that I do. And they're just like, oh, you must have known. And I'm like, no, I genuinely did not know any of this would come. What I did know was I wanted to be a master of my own destiny. What I did know was that I was good at language and persuasion and ability to communicate well. What I did know was I'd be a terrible, terrible employee. So I knew I needed to be self-employed, whatever I ended up doing. I knew those kind of things, which then naturally led me with help, with mentoring, with life chances, led me to where I am now. But that 7-year-old boy, at that moment, it's like a lifetime away, multiple lifetimes of imagination that required to get to this point, frankly. So.
have you been back to? I know you went back to Kenya in your gap. Have you been back to Somalia since?
No, I've never been back. I've never been to Somalia since because it's just not been. I always joke that. People say, "Oh, but why don't you want to help rebuild the country and do so much and make a difference and so on?" And I'm like, well, it ruined my first 10 years. It took me 10 years to get on my feet. I'm now enjoying the following 10 years. Why would I want to then take a step back to kind of restart that story again? I'm just like, I would love to show you. I've got a picture of my 4-year-old, of me around the same age as him. And the way we stand is almost identical. It's so scary. It's so scary. At the age of 4, I've got a picture of me at 4 and him at 4, and it's just like uncanny. And you realise how much the apple doesn't fall far from the tree.
Amazing. Let's see some.
Thank you so much. I'm Maz. I work for Stanton Williams Architects. Actually, I'm a model maker and artist, but I also run a lot of their outreach programmes working with young people and teenagers. And we spend a lot of time trying to persuade young people from more diverse backgrounds to get into architecture, because I'm really passionate about the idea of diversifying architecture. But I think without the backing of the bank of mum and dad, a lot of those young people are probably going to be those people that are going to be really struggling. Well, I'm already seeing it with the architectural assistants, really struggling in terms of housing. So you mentioned there's always barristers. Is there other things I should be encouraging younger people to get into in terms of having a say in their, maybe not just from a money perspective, but just in general, is it architecture, like planning?
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned that, because I can tell you this, for us, recruiting from diverse communities isn't just a buzzword, it literally makes a difference on the job that we do, so it's critical for us. But he said, if there's a young, talented person like you, Hashi, it makes sense that you go into a profession where you can make a difference in your family's lives. Here, can't offer them money, can't offer them glory because they can't talk about what they're doing. And so what we end up getting is people who, 3rd generation Secret Service, makes it easier for us to vet them because we know mum and dad. And they don't really need the money because they've grown up in an environment where they're probably secure. And he's like, what do we do? So the answer to what I'm saying to you is everyone is facing this. Everyone is facing this. Because if you're an MI5 officer and you're expected to move down from Glasgow to London, how are you going to afford to live in London? So they end up subsidizing people. So you know, if you're starting out at MI5, you're getting paid 25, 30, 35,000 pounds. They have a program of subsidizing your home. You're not going to ever probably get to 100 grand, but you're expected to love your work, not betray your country, and stay focused. And what you then see is people who, and this is really serious, people who end up joining are people who are either generationally in the Secret Service, but people who don't see money as an issue at all, because that's a big part of that job. So money is like incidental to their lives, as opposed to for somebody like me, money is central to where I came from because it made a difference. Now, money is more or less incidental to my children's lives. But that's the challenge that we face, is if you're a young person and you're talented and you've come up from a relatively deprived background, it's a natural instinct to say, I'm here to not only make a difference in my own life, but I've got to make a difference for a generation because I have that responsibility. I have that weight on my shoulders, and so on and so forth. So I don't know whether I've answered your question other than to widen it and say you're not the only one facing this problem.
My name is Sarah. I'm EC1. That's where I'm from. EC1. Question. Well, actually, first on nomenclature. Respectfully, on nomenclature, I ask that you don't vilify, because your spoken word and your written word are very, very important.
Yeah.
I ask that you don't vilify the landlord.
Okay.
With terms like slumlord or landlord. I noticed there was a lot of he genderization.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give you crap about the gender part, but I will say that sort of divisiveness of thought doesn't help the situation, and the best way to remediate bad landlords is to create financial penalties. But the vast majority of landlords can and should and do their job. The second thing I would say is also maybe don't dismiss the BTR, what I should say, the rental, the more institutional rental marketplace, which is now responding. So London is one of the few cities where the vast majority of people own their own home. It's actually the opposite of New York. New York, 70% people, same size, by the way, it's 9 million people, 70% rent, 30% own. It's reverse here. Every man's home is their castle.
Yeah.
The BTR marketplace, which is only in its infancy, it's only been really around for 10 years.
Even less in some places, yeah.
Really is facilitating a commercialization of rental product, because it does something that we desperately need, and that's create stability for renters. I just looked at my lease with my husband. My landlord can get me out, not a slumlord, my landlord happens to be a library company, can get me out with 2 months' notice. And how disruptive that is for me as someone who has children in a school system, nearby, if I'm dealing with catchment zones, like the fact that you don't have that in BTR. Those people are expected to rent. So when you also think about the people who are buying assets here internationally and buying assets, oftentimes it's not for their children. It's often to rent it out. So you have so many of the buy to let. That's a market that needs to go. So if you're thinking about sort of foreign investment, that would be something, rules around that, penalties around that, some type of commercialization of the multifamily market would be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Let me just respond to that briefly.
And if we bring the mic here.
Yeah, bring the mic.
Thank you.
First of all, I think you're absolutely right that it doesn't help to vilify the language. Interestingly, in the book, somebody pointed out to me that I don't use the word NIMBY. I purposefully avoided that. And because I agree with you, it doesn't make for a conducive and productive conversation. But I also agree with you very strongly that the vast majority, I'd say probably 70 to 80% of landlords get it right in many places, and many of them are doing it because of the market that is created in the world that we live in. But where I would slightly disagree with you is if you look at the landlord world as we knew it and built to rent as we now have it, incidentally what tended to happen is because the market by landlords in many places has been either so unreliable or unhelpful or never quite worked for people, this market sprung up to frankly try and respond to the less than subpar world that existed here. And I get that. But what I'm saying is the built to rent sector is more secure, it's cleaner, it's better, it's more centrally located in many places. I live in Wembley, 8,000 units. But I still maintain that it's a solution to a problem we shouldn't have. It's a solution to the problem of these landlords who completely cornered the market based on the kind of environment that the market's created for them, to which now this world has had to respond. And the other big part of it is that if they've also cornered the market, particularly where I am, they're right next to Wembley Park Station. In 2 stops you can be in Baker Street, right? If you're a young professional, you're paying £2,000-3,000 a month to have a really, really lovely place. That's 70-80% of your salary going to this. So what kind of environment are you creating through the built to rent sector, which is responding to the market, to then say to these young people, 70 to 80% of your money is going to go to this institutional investor, taking you further away to be able to get your own home one day, and taking you further away from having proper security.
Hi, my name's Rick. I work for an organisation called Homeless Link, so I just want to talk about that end of this.
You've invited me to something
yes,
recently,
that's
haven't you?
Yeah, that's not the reason I'm here.
Okay.
Yes, it is. It is the reason.
Stalking me.
But so my question is, I wonder what would it mean to build and plan with an explicit agenda to try and end homelessness? Homelessness in this country is, crazy numbers. You've seen all the statistics, whether it's rough sleeping, sofa surfing, temporary accommodation, which is bankrupting councils, and so on. What would it mean to have a planning agenda which was explicitly designed to end homelessness rather than, I don't know, sustain capitalism? Or to put it another way, I mean, because I agree with something you said, I think wherever there's a millionaire's row, there's probably a Skid Row. Because I think that is just the way these things kind of work. So what would it mean for local planners to prioritise the inhabitants of Skid Row rather than the inhabitants of millionaires' row?
Yeah, I think that I've been thinking about this a lot. How do we respond to a homelessness environment where so many people are either rough sleeping, sofa surfing, insecurity? We spent something like 2 to 3 billion last year on temporary accommodation. Wow. I mean, that's insane. And that usually goes to a landlord who might also be an owner of a former council house that's being rented back out to the council, right? It's insane. But the thing about the homelessness situation, and you might see I'm wearing my Centrepoint badge. I'm a big supporter of their work. I used to live in one of their properties. It's very hard to untangle the homelessness issue and a personal health, substance abuse, sexual abuse, family breakdowns. In people's consciousness, when they think about particularly long-term homelessness, it's inextricably linked to a societal malaise at the heart of it. And so it's not true, and it's not the case, because most people who might be homeless or in homeless precariousness have got no other particular issues that's holding them back, but that's the way we've linked the issue. And I suppose what I'm saying to you is, in order for us to make progress on that front, it might just be a case of a different conversation about what it means to be homeless, what it means to be insecure, what it means to be sofa surfing, what it means to be living in temporary accommodation, what it means to have this precariousness, and moving the conversation on. Centrepoint, dealing with young people in particular, is heartbreaking, because they will be able to accept young people up to a certain age, but the moment they reach 18, 19, 20, it's almost like the tap stops, which is insane, because they should really be trying to find a way of transitioning. And that's the hardest part for me, is how do we get that transition so that if you help somebody up to the age of 18, 19, you don't just switch off the tap and say, I'm really sorry, but financially I can't support you anymore. If you look at the correlation between people who are growing up in care and who end up becoming homeless later, it's crazy, the link. It's crazy. People who've been in abusive homes and them ending up with substance abuse and homelessness. I was saying to Arthur earlier that I get a lot of letters from prison because of my first book, a lot. And then you realize how many of these young people grew up in very precarious set of circumstances. Some crazy percentage of people in prison today suffer from substance abuse generally, mental health problems, got into the prison system early on, couldn't break the cycle, and so on. And so when you think about the fact that we've got 80, 90,000 people in prison, a sizable chunk goes right back to childhood. Sizable. And it's the same conversation about homelessness, I think.
My name's Paul Lincoln. I live down the road in Golden Lane Estate, which was built by the City of London in 1957, and it absolutely fits into your idea of a post-war estate committed to public health. And so a question about the role of the local authority. How would you persuade this local authority to repeat that incredibly kind of socialist vision of a public health estate one more time?
Fantastic question, thank you.
My name is Phil Cooper. I'm a retired architect, but I've worked in public and private housing and latterly set up my own house building company. Track back to when you started off saying that housing was dealt with by Ministers of Health, which I can remember, and dear Harold Macmillan, Conservative Minister of Health, criticising the Conservatives for selling off the family silver. You seem to suggest at the beginning, before we diversified into MI5, etc., that maybe, and maybe I got this wrong, so I'd like you to clarify, is it tenure that you see as being a problem, i.e. with the demise of public housing, council housing as we used to call it, with the demise of public housing and the mantle was meant to have been passed to housing associations? Do you see that the tenure is the problem, and do you see that Penny Cook's idea of leasehold reform and common hold might be the answer? Loads of questions there, sorry.
No, very good question there. To think about the first question in terms of convincing a local authority, I am absolutely clear in my own mind that any local authority that wishes to see the fullest potential realised, this is a no-brainer. There's a really good documentary called Newtown Utopia. It's on Amazon Prime, Newtown Utopia, and it's all about the founding of Basildon. And it's worth watching because it talks about this whole new community that was leaving at the outskirts of London and going to Basildon. And everyone's house just being open and just a huge community. And there's a moment when a daughter is asking her father, when do you think things changed? And he was very clear, it was when Right to Buy came about. And he said, oh yeah, very clear, when Right to Buy came about, before Right to Buy, we all had our doors open. When Right to Buy came about, those people who started buying their houses started closing their doors because they were doing stuff inside the houses that somebody else might not be able to afford. But because these houses all looked pretty identical, you'd start being able to tell who had money to spend and who hadn't. For me, thinking about housing for the public good beyond the metrics of the market is such a no-brainer for local authorities. TfL, you being, do you know how much land TfL owns around London? Like, so much land.
I do. I sit on the Land and Property Committee. Very excited.
It is insane how much land they have that we could be using for the public good.
We are. 20,000 homes in the pipeline.
But that's the kind of imagination that I think is possible. And the simple answer to that is you do not want to waste potential. And the other thing I always say to people is, if we did it once, why couldn't we do it again? That's really like what it comes down to. It's not like we're trying to imagine a whole new thing. If we did it before, why are we not doing it again? Very quick story on Harold Macmillan. When I was researching for the book, I was reading Harold Macmillan's diaries. And he was in the public health department as a public health minister. Then Winston Churchill said to him, I'm going to make you the housing minister. And Winston Churchill makes him the housing minister when he's prime minister. And Harold Macmillan's very ambitious, wants to be prime minister one day himself. And in his diary, he talks about how he felt that Churchill was setting him a trap because he thought he would never deliver on the housing. And therefore, if he fails on that, he'll never be prime minister. And so Macmillan talks about in his diaries how he needed to build these bloody houses. And there's this fantastic clip that came to light recently. You have to see it. When the Queen passed away in 2022, all these amazing archives the BBC started putting online, telling the Queen's story. And of course, that whole period of building, she was going around these new places and opening them up. But there's this great clip of Harold Macmillan wearing a three-piece suit, just like Arthur, and standing in front of a bloody, this old Etonian who would never stood a bloody building site. And you could see them in the back literally laying the bricks. And he says, this here is our housing message. The more you build, the more you will be asked to build, and the more you will build. Like this amazing clip. And he just stands there and he's like, looking like, am I finished, And we've not built what we need annually ever since Harold Macmillan. So to your question about tenure, I agree with you. Fundamentally, what it comes down to is choice. If a security of tenure is available to people, and there is a genuine choice between being able to rent, to buy, and to live in a home for as long as you like, for whatever purpose serves that moment in your life, to be able to give back the keys and go to Cambodia for 5 years, come back and pick up another set of keys, and not buy if you don't want to, but buy if you would like to, and so on. That for me is the utopia. It's not the 1.5 million that everyone should be able to own. I think to fundamentally answer your question, it's about that choice, and the choice does come down to that security of tenure. I completely agree.
And as the bells of St Paul tolls, huge thanks to our speaker,